Hi, I'm Randy Wooden, and welcome to another in our Edge Library series. We're talking now to the folks in transition and how to handle the question of money and what are you looking for when you get into the interview. Now, that's a difficult question for a lot of people, and actually it's one of the money that is one of the very few things that you really don't want to talk about. I mean, you'd love to talk about your skills and accomplishments and why you're a fit for the position, but things like money, things like why did you leave your last job, especially if it didn't go all that well, what are your weaknesses, those sorts of things usually trip people up a little bit. So we'll cover those in other library series, but in this case we're going to talk a little bit about money and how to handle that difficult question. Now, as we both know, we don't want to get hung up on money. Certainly don't want to come in there and say on your forehead, I need to make, let's say, $70,000 a year. Because if you do that, now the rest of the time they're going to look at this 70 and say, is this guy worth it? Is he worth it? I would much rather have them get to know me, get to like me, get to feel I'm a good fit, and then they may be more apt to pay me a little bit more. But I need to create that emotional bond first. So it's certainly not in your interest to have to address that question early in the interview. But if it does come up early, sometimes that's a screen out device. It's a way for the employer to say, hey, you know what? Before I get too invested in this fellow, I need to see if I end up liking him, can I afford him? So it's a quick screen out tool. So early on in the interview, if they ask you, what are you looking for? I use the analogy of a stoplight. I've got a red light, a yellow light, and a green light. In traffic, green light means keep going. Yellow light means kind of slow down. Let's talk about this a little bit, if you will. And the red light means stop. Don't go anywhere. Let's address it now. So the question early in the interview, what are you looking for, Randy? What I would do is I would respond and say that certainly something that we'd like to talk about. I'm not sure I understand enough about the position at this point. Perhaps we can talk a little bit more. I'm sure we'll be able to work something out and then change the subject. So that's one way to go about it. Other phrasing you could say, I'd certainly look to be paid based on my skills and experience and the requirements of the position. I'm sure you've got a range in mind and would be able to work that out, and then change the subject. That's the key, change the subject. Now, interview goes on a little bit. They ask you that same question or something similar. What are you looking for? What sort of money are you looking for? Compensation, that sort of thing. When they ask it again, think yellow light. Yellow light means dodge the question, don't answer it, and turn around and ask them what they had in mind. You might be surprised. Many times the employer will tell you the range they had in mind. After all, they want to talk about it. They brought it up, right? So in this case, if they say, what are you looking for? Then what you can do is to say, well, like anyone, I'd look to be paid based on the scope of the duties and in my experience. I'm sure you have a range in mind, and I wonder, could I ask what that is? Fine, let them talk. Now, later in the interview, when they ask you that question, typically that's somewhat of a buying signal. Let's face it, if they've spent time with you and they have very little interest, I doubt they're going to ask, what's it going to cost? Think about you when you go to buy something. Go to a yard sale, go to the store, go anywhere. Anywhere you go, if there's not a price written on there and you have no interest in the product, you're not going to ask. But if you have an interest, at some point then you're going to ask, what does that cost? Same thing with an employer. So toward the end of the interview, what I'd encourage you to do is do this red light. Okay? Red light means stop, deal with it, give them a range. So what you would do is say, I understand what you're looking for. I'm excited about the opportunity. I feel like we've got a potential for a good fit here. And based on my research, based on my understanding of the position, and looking at my skills, I would envision something in the blank to blank range. Then ask the question, how does that fit in with what you were thinking? Now, the range that you just gave, worst thing you can do, by the way, is to give a specific number. You don't want to come out and say $58,000. That's a line in the sand, and that's tough to work around. Next worst thing to do is to name a range that is phrased with hard numbers on each end. Example, 50 to 60. Let's face it, the employer hears only 50. And if the offer comes in at all, you'll probably see it at 50, 51, maybe 52. They didn't hear 60, but that's human nature. So what I want to do, if I feel the job should pay, let's say the job's about a mid-50s sort of job, then the bottom of the range that I select, the bottom of that range, then would need to be mid-50s. So the bottom of the range is what I think the job is likely to pay. So when they ask me, I'd say, well, I would envision something in the mid-50s to perhaps mid-60s. How does that fit in with what you were thinking? The reason you give a range and use words like mid, low, high, upper is to create what I call wiggle room. Mid-50s to the employer could mean 54, maybe even as low as 53, certainly 55. To the candidate, mid-50s could mean 54, 55, 56, and upward. So what you've done is create a little bit of space there. So if the offer comes in at, let's say, 54, if you wanted to, you could go back and try to negotiate more money, or there are other things you can negotiate, vacation, that sort of thing. But if you came out and said 55 and the offer came in at 55 or better, now you've got a credibility gap because you had already said, I'll take a position at that amount of money. So you try to create a little bit of wiggle room for yourself, and that's a way to handle the money question. And that's going to wrap it up for this, our Edge Library series, dealing with folks in transition and handling that difficult, what are you looking for money-wise question. I'm Randy Wooden. Thanks for watching.